to the Hope for the Animals podcast, sponsored by Compassionate Living. I'm your host, Hope Bohannic, and you can find all our archived shows by going to our website, hopefortheanimalspodcast.org. And please come and engage with us on social media. We're on Facebook and Instagram. Today, we are continuing our focus on my new book that I edited, The Humane Hoax, Essays Exposing Happy Meat, Humane Dairy, and Ethical Eggs. We had a lot of fun last episode with some of the Humane Hoax Project team talking about the book, kind of book club style, our first session of the Humane Hoax Book Club. Next episode, we're actually going to do the second session of the book club. But today, we're going to dig into just one of the chapters with author Nicolas Carter. It was just Earth Day, so keeping that energy going, keeping with the Earth Day theme, we'll be talking about the greenwashing aspects of the humane hoax and examining labels like grass-fed and regenerative grazing and carbon-neutral beef. So stay tuned for that. So I wanted to tell you all that the book is doing really well. It was #1 on the Amazon's new releases for the animal rights category for the first week that it was out. I was really shocked about that and so excited. And I had people asking me like how I did that. Like if I or the publisher had something to do with that, but no, we didn't. I think we were both just as shocked and really thrilled that this book resonated. It's really been resonating, I think, with people. The book was reviewed by Mark Beckoff on his Psychology Today column, the acclaimed author of books on animal emotion, Mark Beckoff, and he has a column in Psychology Today online. So he did a review that was posted recently. So that is really exciting. And I have podcast appearances and other interviews scheduled. I'm going to be doing an in-person book launch gathering in Eugene, Oregon. So if you are in or near Eugene, please join me on Saturday, June 10th for that. I'll announce that again when we get closer with more details. And another event coming up that I wanted to share with you is our Humane Hoax Online Conference coming up on Saturday, May 20th. This will be our 4th annual conference of this conference, and we will be focusing on the book and featuring some of the authors. We'll have Karen Davis of United Poultry Concerns. The legendary Karen Davis will be with us. We will also have Professor of Philosophy Robert Jones joining us to talk about his chapter. His chapter was called Modern Foodie Culture, a Celebration of Violence. So that should be interesting. And also presenting will be Ingrid Taylor, whose chapter was titled A Pig Called Silver. We talked about this chapter in the last episode of this podcast at our Humane Hoax Book Club session. We all loved this chapter. I actually loved this chapter so much that I made it the very first chapter of the book. Ingrid grew up on her family's pig farm, a very small family farm, and she shares what she witnessed, what the pigs went through, and she tells the story of one pig, Silver, who her mother adopted into the family home for a while and what that was like. It's a really poignant and powerful chapter, and I can't wait to hear directly from Ingrid, to hear this story at our Humane Hoax online conference, and that will be on Saturday, May 20th. I'll have a link to the details and the registration in the show notes of this episode. But today on the podcast, we have another one of our authors who wrote a chapter in the greenwashing section of the Humane Hoax. The chapter's called Grazing versus the Planet, the failed attempt to greenwash animal farming. Nicolas, he co-founded the website Plant-Based Data with Tushar Mehta, and Tushar was on the podcast, I think last year, talking about this same subject. And Tushar's episode is one of the most listened to and downloaded episodes. So I think this topic really resonates, and Nicolas is just as insightful about these issues. So let's hear more about grazing and greenwashing. All right, I am pleased to welcome to the podcast Nicolas Carter. Nicolas is an ecologist and co-founder of plantbaseddata.org, a library of peer-reviewed studies and summaries calling for plant-based diets. He has his master's in environmental practice, and his thesis focused on global estimates of greenhouse gas emissions attributed to animal agriculture. He also works with Plant Based Treaty as a science and policy analyst and Plant Based News as a data scientist and lead researcher. He's helped launch Canadian Centre for Climate Service, a data hub in Eastern Canada, and so much more. Welcome to the podcast, Nicolas.
Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, well, we are excited to talk to you today. You have written a chapter in the anthology, The Humane Hoax, that I edited, and we are featuring this book for a few podcasts. And I'm so glad that you agreed to be able to be one of the ones to come on, because I think that this is a very, very important chapter that you have written. But we like to start by kind of getting to know you, and we want to ask you when and why you went vegan.
So I went vegan back in 2015. So almost 8 years now. It was November 1st of 2015. So
That's great. You know the date. I love that.
I do. And the context around that is I was about a year into the master's program, studying really a wide range of environmental science. It wasn't specifically focused on agriculture and food, but it was a lot of the kind of the philosophical problems of our environmental space of the world and the practical solutions to shift away. So in doing that, it really only was like one or two case studies that happened to be related to agriculture and food. It was the second course I was in, and it was the one of the reports I was reading was the Food and Agriculture Organization's 2013 report specific to animal agriculture. When I read that and then dove a little bit into the topic, I really just felt like a hypocrite, to be honest. Like up until that point, I was eating the typical Western diet. I had some assumptions about what eating more eco-friendly would be. I certainly knew, on the wider spectrum, what I needed to do in terms of living more eco-friendly. I just knew consuming less things was good, living a bit more minimal, shifting away from, fossil fuels if possible. So when I saw the major issues with our food system and also the opportunities in shifting to plant-based diets, I just saw that this is clearly a very important thing that I should do, that I should look further into. So my partner at the time, now my wife, I told her literally within a couple of days, I was like, why don't we try this? Let's try this for 30 days. And the first thing she said was, you're crazy. We're not doing that. But then of course I told her a bit more of why, told her why I think this is important. Here's what the research is saying. So we needed some groceries one time, and we decided over 30 days to immerse ourselves in it and really give it a good attempt. And that went well. So that's kind of when I started, and never turned back ever since.
So let's talk about your chapter. I want to start by saying that I feel that your chapter is probably one of the most important chapters in the book. I mean, we have a few chapters in the greenwashing section, the environmental section of the book, but yours is focused in on regenerative animal agriculture and other things. But regenerative animal agriculture, it's becoming such a huge focus of reform in animal ag, in environmental circles, and it's so critical to unpack. And with the looming climate crisis, I just feel that this is so important to for people to know about. So I love your chapter. But let's start a bit more broadly. Why should we be concerned with the environmental impact of animal agriculture, animal farming, animal products? You really did an excellent job in the beginning of your chapter, kind of spelling out why animal agriculture is such an important sector to be focusing on when we're looking at climate change. And you said, I'll quote you from the chapter here. You said, big livestock is a major polluter, just like big oil. And the top 5 meat and dairy companies combined emit more greenhouse gases than ExxonMobil, Shell, or BP. I mean, it's so stunning. So, what is the big picture of food and the environment based on the scientific literature today?
Oftentimes, when we think about the environmental impacts of different practices, we are so often focusing just on carbon dioxide and just from energy. And I think there's a few reasons why that's happened. I think that's been the media focus, that's been country specific focus. But when you're looking at the wider picture of environmental metrics, I'm talking greenhouse gases besides carbon dioxide, but also methane, nitrous oxide in particular. Also, how much greenhouse gases we can draw down, changing how we use land by rewilding, by protecting old forests. But then also outside of greenhouse gas emissions, think about total land degradation, soil degradation, water use. When you're going down this list, you're also thinking of all the wild animals, how much space we've taken away from wild animals, and the essentially extinction of species that we're experiencing right now. Then it becomes absolutely clear that agriculture and food systems is the single largest human pressure we have on Earth. And it's threatening local ecosystems. It is driving this mass extinction of species. One of the most important metrics when you're thinking about all this is land. So thinking of all habitable land, so not the kind of ice barren or rocky areas of land, but all the habitable areas on Earth, 50% of it is used for agriculture as a whole, and 83%, so more than 3/4 of that, is used specifically for animal agriculture, and in the rest for plant agriculture. But of that land that's used for animal agriculture, it only provides back 18% of global calories. So it's not even like that land is being used efficiently. It's being used in a very extensive manner because, of course, there's billions of animals. They need to be fed. Some of them need pasture and extensive areas of land to roam. So this is a big metric when you're looking at all this. And then when you're looking a bit to the future, you see countries that as they typically get richer, they typically consume more animal source foods. So what this brings us to is a choice, right? It gives us the ability to now look at the situation, look at the food system we've created, and decide, do we want to keep this current system and kind of export it to all these other countries, or do we want to make changes and innovate and shift diets and go about the many different ways we can spark transformational change in this space? And there's been studies on this. So looking at currently right now, of all that land used for animal agriculture, that's 3 billion hectares of land. So that's equivalent to all of the continent of Africa. Now, if all the countries that are currently, developing economically more and becoming more rich, if the current Western diet is exported to all these other countries, we'll continue using that amount of land plus an entire equivalent to another continent of Africa and all of Europe combined. So we're talking, amount of land that essentially does not exist without a mass program of more deforestation. And I just don't understand why anyone would want to turn the whole planet into, a big animal farm when we don't need to, and we have many other options. They're very accessible. They're becoming increasingly accessible. So, there's a number of different comparisons you can do across those environmental metrics, but land use is one of the most important ones. And when you kind of think about regenerative agriculture and the kind of theory of change of what they call regenerative ranching, that uses at least 2.5 times more land than even typical grass-fed beef. So that's just not biophysically possible without mass deforestation and so on. So this is why that's such an important topic.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, you said, I wouldn't know why anyone would want to export this and keep it going. Well, I do. It's money. And there's a very few, but powerful group of people who do want to see it continue, and they know these problems have been brought to light, and that's where we get into greenwashing, and that's what the Humane Hoax is about. That's what the book is about. So let's get into these supposed sustainable labels. Why are they not what the industry wants you to believe they are.
So many of these labels are largely a part of capitalism as a whole. They're industry funded, they're industry, marketing tools. You nailed it by discussing that this is all related to money, right? The idea that we want to expand animal agriculture, of course, is related to money and financial interests and business as usual. At the same time, there is a lot of risk assessments happening and looking at what would happen if we continue going down this path of environmental degradation and what that would do purely on the economic side too. So as much as it is financial interests that are driving expansion and financial interest in kind of creating these greenwashing labels, there's also a lot of risk assessment happening and showing that, okay, if we don't get this right, no matter how much greenwashing you're doing, it's going to result in more expensive practices, more expense on the production of these types of damaging foods in this case. So yeah, I think there's a number of things going on there in terms of why this is happening. The most often ones that I'm seeing now pop up when it comes to animal agriculture is this idea that there is carbon neutral or carbon negative beef. I'm seeing that with largely no regulations at all. There's no certification process in terms of third party outside of industry assessment. And it's not like that's unique to this space because we've seen that as well with other certifications in the past. Even some of the most highly respected certifications like the Rainforest Alliance, there's all kinds of issues with them. When I was looking at kind of this topic, big picture early on at, what we need to do in our food space, I looked at a lot of these different labels to say, okay, is this something that we should be relying on? Oftentimes the answer is no. Oftentimes we want to look at, okay, types of foods we want to shift to, because looking at these labels, they're largely in place to help these businesses continue as is, to help sell more and, maybe make some method changes or some process changes, but it's not intended to shift to an entirely new product, you could say. So I think they're very problematic in a number of ways. And they're not all bad, but most of them are a distraction. Most of them are put there to deceive consumers, not having the consumer and the planet at the top of mind.
Yeah, so let's get into some specifics about regenerative animal grazing and animal farming, because this is really becoming so prevalent. I know that the farm bill's coming up, and there's money that is going to be allocated to regenerative animal farming. It's just very, very frustrating. So first, just kind of explain what it is, maybe in a general sense, this regenerative animal farming and grazing, and then also why it's not really an improved method of farming animals.
Happy to. Yeah. So backing up a little bit, regenerative agriculture as a whole, I think it's important to understand what that is first, because then you can understand a bit of how regenerative ranching and grazing fits in too. So regenerative agriculture, it's largely a not defined term at the moment. It's a bit of a buzzword, but it typically involves planting cover crops, limiting or using no synthetic fertilizers or pesticides at all, reducing tillage or not tilling the land at all. These things, like these three or four things there, are well established as, quality forms of agriculture. They're not new. They're forms of like conservation agriculture that date back millennial. Like if you look at different indigenous cultures, they've farmed in this way.
Mm.
But the new kind of co-opting of this term to also include grazing, typically it involves something called holistic grazing, or something called mob grazing or adaptive multi-paddock grazing. There are different forms.
Rotational grazing.
Rotational grazing. Yeah, there's different slight variations to these. The main idea is to not have overgrazing happening. And how they're doing that is typically through fencing. Depending on what style you're choosing there, you're fencing for different periods of time, but you're allowing other areas of the land to recover and rewild until they're grazed again. The problem is, there's many problems with this. They're relying on some sort of belief that grazing is integral and absolutely necessary to the regenerative agriculture for ways to improve agriculture as a whole. Very little, if not any evidence to show this is possible. Now, can better forms of grazing improve the land? Of course. But when you're looking at these studies and look at the benefits of regenerative grazing, typically what they're comparing to is a previous very intensive form of grazing, or they're comparing to a highly intensive industrial plant agriculture form. And the ironic thing about that is typically what they're comparing to is feed crop land. They're not typically comparing to kind of organic plant agriculture for human consumption. Typically, they're comparing to their own kind of industrial animal agricultural model.
Yep.
But in doing that, you of course can show some improvements. You can show that you can draw down some carbon. You can show that you're not going to hurt the soil as much, and you might even improve it a bit. But what's rarely ever happened when looking at this kind of form of regenerative agriculture is comparing it to rewilding. Because if we shift to plant-based diets, as discussed early on in this podcast, we would free up just a huge amount of land to be able to rewild, to be able to return land to nature, to draw down just a massive amount of carbon. And there's been some studies on that too. If we look at the hypothetical scenario where everyone shifted to plant-based diets, with that scenario, we draw down the equivalent of 16 years of our current fossil fuel emissions by 2050. So that's just a very significant amount of carbon we could draw down, and also bring back areas of land for wildlife to recover, some of them that are on the verge of extinction. In kind of a more realistic scenario, say we shift more to like 80-90% plant-based diets, we could still draw down the equivalent of 9 years of our current fossil fuel equivalent emissions. And that's a study from Matthew Hayek that looked at that, and some others as well. Looking at regenerative agriculture as a whole, there's many ways we can make agriculture more regenerative, but the idea that integrating cattle grazing into the whole scenario is only going to increase methane. It's only going to increase land use, has the possibility of degrading the land further. It's far from the only way of helping improve the land, and you're going to see limitations in terms of how much you can improve the land in that way. You're never going to have full forest when you're going to have grazing happening on the land. There is forms of like agroforestry where you can bring back, some forms of a forest, but that's not what we need. We need to revert previous deforested land back to forest, protect what forest we already have, and then we'll be in a better space. And I just don't see how in any way possible that's going to be achievable with this narrative of regenerative ranching.
Yeah, and it also requires extensive fencing, like you were saying. I mean, numerous paddocks and fencing in a large area, and that can disrupt wildlife migrations of larger mammals. Did you want to talk about the fencing?
With regards to fencing, there's been a study that looked at what happened when pasture land was abandoned, because of course that happens all across the world and it has been happening for decades. For whatever reason, pasture land is abandoned, and oftentimes it's just passively allowed to rewild. And there's a study last year out of the University of Alberta that looked at exactly this. It was a meta-analysis that looked at all the comparisons of what happens to land when it's just let be, when pasture land is let to passively rewild. And across all categories of biodiversity, it increased abundance. And we're not even just talking about wild animals, we're talking about plants as well. Because oftentimes when you're talking about grazing land for cattle, it really can be like a monoculture of the same type of grass. And oftentimes it's not a natively appropriate grass either. It's whatever can grow the fastest. Cattle will prefer eating certain types of grass and kind of overeat those, and that's what kind of leads to some overgrazing or degradation to the soil. So I think, yeah, in terms of like removing fences, it's absolutely important. And there's a great documentary I'll just give a shout out to as well. It's called Rewilding a Mountain. It involved a number of different researchers, William Ripple being one of them, who's done phenomenal work in this space in terms of kind of rewilding the American West. And it's a short documentary. I think it's about 30 minutes long. And it just showed exactly that. What happens when, in this case, public land is let to rewild and you remove the pressures of grazing. And the results speak for themselves. They're phenomenal, and they're documented in that documentary and also in peer-reviewed literature as well.
So I want to ask about grass-fed beef. which is different than regenerative in a way. I mean, I think they have similarities. Maybe you can kind of let us know what the distinction is. But I'm curious about this one in particular because, it's so interesting to me because when I've been looking deeply into the humane hoax and greenwashing, I'm always amazed at how some of the labels and farming methods are actually even worse than conventional, right? And most people think that there's at least some improvement, but what I found with some of these labels, it's not even just a tiny bit better, it's not neutral, but it can be worse. And grass
Mhm.
fed is one of those labels. Grass fed cows release more methane than grain fed cows. You said that in your chapter. Do you want to talk about that?
Happy to. Yeah. I think it's first important to understand that almost all of the deforestation in the Amazon is as a result of grass fed beef. So
Mm,
there's this kind of like idea that like because it's grass fed, or in this case, people might be referred to grass finished in this case, because all cattle at some point in their life are out on pasture. Typically, there's different levels of intensity for feedlots, but that's usually, the final few months of their short lives anyway. But a big reason why grass finished beef has a higher environmental footprint is two main things. One, it's going to take about twice as much time to get to a commercial weight, you could say, which is just like a very sad way of putting it. But this is their business model. So it takes a longer time. We're talking about typically about 20 months for a typical cow to be raised to be then slaughtered for beef. To grass finish is typically about 30 months. So again, they're still virtually babies, but because they can live, of course, about 20 years.
yeah.
So this longer amount of time means they're emitting more methane during that time. And then when they're finished on grass versus grain or soy or corn, they're eating a more fibrous diet. And the more fibrous diet results in a lot more methane being belched out. And so there's been studies on this that showed that it could even be as much as more than 40% more methane emitted from that space.
Hmm.
So this is when it comes to food, there's like a lot of misconceptions on what would be more environmentally friendly. A lot of people, and I think I even thought this before too, like you think eating local, eating grass finished is more humane, it's more eco-friendly, but the data just doesn't back that up. And it shows that a lot of time consumers have been manipulated to believe these things because of different imaging, different marketing campaigns. These aren't just things that people think on their own. I think this is the result of years and years and decades of marketing and subsidies and paid for experts, campaigns to really greenwash and make it seem like this industry is eco-friendly.
Yeah, and is making improvements and listening and trying to adapt and reform, and that's just not the case.
Yeah, and when it comes to land use, there was a study as well in 2018 from Harvard and Boston University researchers, and it showed that if the U.S. wanted to match the current factory farm beef to grass-fed and not alter their beef consumption, U.S. beef production would require 63 to 270% more land.
Wow.
And yes, keep in mind about at the current rate right now, animal agriculture uses almost 50% of all land in the US and, anywhere from about 35 to 45% globally. So it just goes to show that this is the the last thing we should be doing. And really, when looking at all the different food options that people have, grass finished beef, which is what's being marketed as eco-friendly, is actually the opposite. It's the absolute worst thing people could be eating for the planet.
Yeah. Yeah, it's amazing. It's just so frustrating people don't know this. I mean, that's why they're reaching for the grass-fed beef is they think it's better. They're paying more money. They think it's better for the environment, better for the animals, and it can be even worse. It's crazy. So, speaking of land, there's a common argument that most of the land that is used for grazing cows has no other purpose, that it's marginal land or it's wasted if we don't use it for grazing. And it's always such an annoying argument to me because it's so human centered, it's so human focused that land would have to have a purpose for us, right? And not for the planet or for other animals. But this is one of the arguments that we have to graze the cows there because we can't do anything else with the land. You can't grow plant food, whatever. Can you talk about this claim?
First, thank you for bringing up that this is very human centered, because that's exactly what I think of first when it comes to this line of thinking. But even looking at the data, 42% of all pasture land as it is right now used to be a forest or at least a woody savanna. And this was a study from Tim Searchinger and others in 2018 that kind of mapped this out. So a lot of the land that actually is degraded right now, and that these meat proponents will claim is marginal land, it can only be used for grazing, actually used to be a forest. But
Right.
if you're looking at, say, native grasslands, of course, in the Canadian West and the prairies, some of it, of course, was native grassland. In every situation, too, that would be far better to rewild, let it to continue to be a native grassland, and actually bring back the native ruminants and other animals that were displaced from ranching over decades. And as a part of kind of a predator prey relationship in the wild, this is going to be far better for the ecosystem. There's lots of evidence of showing what happens when you reintroduce wolves to ecosystems where they natively were before. It just brings a lot more biodiversity and abundance to plant life as well in that area. So the marginal land is a very manipulative myth. And even if you're looking at like another angle of, okay, well, what actual plant crops can we grow in marginal land? And it's actually quite a bit. There's a number of very hardy plants and even fruit trees that can grow in degraded land. A lot of this is a ploy to continue business as usual. And I've heard someone recently kind of call it like a ranching ransom, like a land ransom, like they're holding it hostage, right? Because they're claiming that's the only use of this land. So it needs to be continued used in that way. But the evidence is just not there at all for that. And even looking at other industries, if land is very degraded and there's really no opportunity to rewild that, there's other uses for it too. You could put some solar panels on that land, and it would still be a much better net benefit than grazing and emitting more methane into the atmosphere and other issues as well.
Yeah, that's a great point. We need land for wind farms, for solar farms. So, yeah, that's a really, really good point. I think another factor is that we really don't need all that much land if everyone is eating a plant-based diet. So much land is going to graze the cows and other farmed animals and then growing the feed to feed them. You don't need that much land. If we're eating a primarily or exclusively plant-based diet, then the amount of land we need is much, much smaller. We just need to grow plants for people. And so we don't need that land, all this, you know, supposedly marginal land. And it could be rewilded or used for other purposes, like you said.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. So something that's not thought of often is our soil and the critical topsoil that is needed, that nutrient dense topsoil that's needed to grow plant life. And globally, there's major soil issues going on. Can you talk about this?
Yeah. So when it comes to soil, there's ways of measuring it in, below ground and above ground. And of course, one of the best ways of kind of storing soil organic carbon is in wild, untouched ecosystems, but also in forest and vegetation that grows up, of course, from the ground. Overall, the picture of soil, there is ways to improve it. And I think one of the most underappreciated way in which we can improve soil is by rewilding. There's some of the most respected soil scientists in the world have quoted a number of different statistics on this topic. And one of them was from Ratan Lal, who showed that 25 to 75% more soil organic carbon is stored in these untouched wild ecosystems versus all agricultural land. So, what reduces agricultural land? Shifting to plant based diets in a big way. So, this is what we should be looking at. And then from there, we can optimize further, grow plants as part of conservation agriculture. But the biggest cause of soil degradation is intensive grazing. And it's been like that for decades. Of course, deforestation obviously also hurts the soil. Some very intensive forms of plant agriculture as well can hurt the soil. But as I mentioned before, at least half of all crops that are grown are for animal feed. It's broken down as about a third, one third of all grains are for animal feed, but as much as 80 or 90% of all soy is for animal feed. And it's not like all that crop being grown is perfectly then converted on a calorie basis over to meat. There's a major feed conversion loss. So when you grow, say 100 calories of grain and feed it to a chicken, which some consider to be a very efficient form of meat. If you feed 100 calories of grain to chicken, you only get 12 calories back in meat. So this is like the largest form of food waste in the world. And food waste is a big problem, but everyone advocating for just food waste should first look at this topic because that's a big issue. So yeah, I think to bring it back around to soil, I think our first focus we should be having is reducing agricultural land and rewilding, and then we're going to get much improvement to soil below and in the carbon stored above ground.
Yeah, it's so interesting that the thing that has degraded the soil, that has destroyed our topsoil, is grazing. And what's being proposed as solving the problem with animal agriculture, more grazing to get the animals out of the confinement barns and regenerative grazing and grass fed. It's like, no, that makes no sense. And I love that you brought up rewilding again. And I have actually a quote here from your chapter, and it says, the carbon sequestration value and the biodiversity benefits from land simply being rewilded and left for nature to restore is considerable and could possibly absorb enough CO2 to turn the tide of the current climate disaster. This is really amazing to think about. We often think that we need all these tech solutions and complex alternatives, but there is actually an easy fix. There is a silver bullet, and that's just leave the planet alone. Let wild spaces come back, regrow, rewild. It's such a simple solution, but will we see it in time? Will we see the value? Because we look at everything, of course, from that human-centered place of having a monetary value. The land has to be productive or whatever, and we have to step back from that and see the community value, the societal value of preserving the planet and letting land be wild and rewild. So important.
It is. And it's not like this isn't documented in some of the world's best scientific analyses. Every single IPCC report that comes out shows the many, many benefits of restoring nature. And they'll categorize it as reduced conversion of natural ecosystems to ecosystem restoration, afforestation, reforestation, sustainable forestry. So they basically will categorize it all in different ways. But the absolute number one way that we can restore nature, draw down carbon, and allow space, like a significant amount of space for wild animals to roam through different ecosystems, is by shifting to plant-based diets.
So you recently debated representatives from white oak pastures, and this particular farm is cited in your chapter. You actually talk about this farm in your chapter and their greenwashing of their animal products that they're producing. So I'd love to hear about this debate. How did this come about and what happened?
So, of course, I've been critical of this particular farm because they've been promoting and marketing their beef as carbon neutral and carbon negative, and they're still doing it to this day. The very interesting thing is the actual industry academic, who I also debated, studied that farm and actually determined that it's not carbon negative beef. Of course, it couldn't even offset the methane emissions that the cows were emitting. Now, of course, the industry academic did say all kinds of favorable things about the farm. But the very interesting thing was that the academic that they hired and the kind of entire industry is using to prop up this type of beef as regenerative beef was discrediting the whole marketing. So, the debate it came about from my analysis of this, my critiques of this study. This is what's considered the number one savory hub. So like the number one regenerative ranch hub. And who I mean by savory is Alan Savory. He's like kind of considered like the leader of this holistic grazing movement.
Yeah.
So I think it's a very fair target to go at this and analyze this farm, see what's actually happening, see what kind of greenwashing is happening. So I happily accepted the offer to debate them. And alongside me was Jimmy Videlli, who's a veganic farmer in Quebec. So the debate was essentially regenerative plant versus animal agriculture. But I mean, I called out that specific issue of, you're still marketing your beef as carbon negative, but even your own kind of industry study was showing that it's not. And yeah, I mean, that was met with a very political answer, basically saying that there's complexity to these studies. And, I would recommend anyone to go take a look to see the sort of manipulative language that's used to prop up and justify this business.
Mm.
They claim that the white oak pastures model is not necessarily scalable, but they claim that it's replicable. So, I mean, this is semantics really, because it's not replicable. This uses far more land. If this was replicated in any sort of level across the world, we would be producing less food. We would be emitting more methane. It might be better than some other intensive uses of farm, but that's within a very narrow lens that we can't rewild. And it's in a very narrow lens that we can instead shift to plant-based diets and make it more accessible to eat plant-based. So I think without having that lens, if we only look at animal agriculture and ways to make it better, they would claim that this is the way to go. And I was saying that no, it's not. It's actually, in many ways, it's actually worse. Certainly in terms of land use, certainly in terms of methane emissions, both of those metrics would be worse. And if you're looking at soil, it might be a little bit better, but it's not the only way to make soil better. So yeah, the debate was, people can see for themselves what they thought. I mean, a lot of it was myself leading with evidence and reason and logic and describing the situation we have with our food space, with biodiversity. And I refer to peer review evidence. I provide that in the show notes. I cite everything I say in terms of the statistics, the conclusions I come to. And it was met with anecdotes, stories, appeals to local food, local economy. The interesting thing about like the appeal that they use for local economy was, they've improved the economic situation in this case, it's in Bluffton, Georgia, Clay County. And of course they improve the economy because they employ lots of people at this very large farm. It's not a small farm, but they've also had a number of lawsuits against them too for underpaying and very poor conditions in their slaughterhouse that they have on site. So yeah, I think there's a whole lot of things that if people are looking at this topic can easily see and unpack. And, the unfortunate thing is people are often not convinced by evidence and reason.
Yeah.
People are often convinced by stories and emotions, right? I think there's a very, I won't say easy, but there's a way of combating this. I think you can still lead with logic and reason, but also help picture all the rewilding, all the nature that we can return by shifting to plant-based diets, because that whole narrative is far, far more logical, more evidence-based, but also like beautiful. And people should love that we can return, land and nature back to these animals, not necessarily for human use, but just because it's the right thing to do. It's the right thing to free up space for other living beings on the planet. And anyway, that's how the debate went. People can kind of take a look. It's a 3-hour debate. These things are difficult, but I think helpful for some people that want to see different sides of it and see the different ways in which people describe, their position.
Yeah, we'll put a link to that debate in the show notes if anybody wants to watch and learn. And yeah, it's interesting that you say that logic and the studies and stuff, it's a difficult sell. And I think that is part of the challenge of the environmental issue, the environmental aspect or greenwashing aspect of the humane hoax of animal agriculture. In the environmental sector, there's so much good, tight, strong evidence with studies, with stats, with peer-reviewed science, but that a lot of people just kind of glaze over. They don't. It's hard to take that in. It's hard to understand all of that. We know as a movement now that stories, that telling the story of individual animals, that this is what moves people. This is what helps people to make change. And I love that you said that there is a narrative, there is storytelling that can occur with the environmental information. That it's beautiful that we can restore and rewild these places and have land for the wildlife and trees to grow and all those things. There is storytelling and picturing there that we should draw on. I love that.
Yeah, and I think that oftentimes it's easy to be very critical of animal agriculture and these big industries that are very damaging for many different ways. But I think it's also important to equally discuss and share the many solutions and progress to build momentum and tell the story of, okay, you don't like this situation here. Well, what situation would you like to see instead? I think that's an opportunity to do a lot of things better in terms of that, because there's no shortage of solutions and ways in which we can shift to plant-based diets, and nature would appreciate that.
So, in your chapter, you talk about veganic farming, vegan organic farming. And I really wish that there was more energy around this. There was more people talking about veganic farming, because I think it's so amazing. It's such a great prospect. And I wish I could buy veganic food. So, would you talk about veganic farming, what it is, and why it's important for, to possibly solve some of these issues?
Happy to, yes. So veganic farming is otherwise known as vegan organic farming. There's also different names for it in terms of stock-free organic farming, and that's more of a kind of the less of the ethical component to it. But many farmers over many decades have been farming stock-free, which means there's no manure used and no synthetic fertilizers used. But veganic farming is, it's a type of organic and production of food crops, focusing on the minimal amount of harm and exploitation to any animal. So it doesn't involve pesticides, it doesn't involve manure, and it doesn't use, of course, those other things like blood meal, bone meal, fish meal, feather meal, anything derived from slaughterhouses. Like, this is obviously the right way to go for many, many reasons. And looking back hundreds of years ago, this is not anything new either. There's been indigenous populations that have been growing veganically. They would call it different forms. The Three Sisters form of growing squash, corn, and squash, corn, and bean, or maize instead of corn. That was, of course, grown in a stock-free environment. And many island cultures across the world grew many crops that didn't have, of course, manure or synthetic fertilizers. So it's absolutely achievable and it's absolutely scalable. And when doing this, in some situations, it was shown that it might decrease yield a little bit in terms of other forms of plant agriculture. But when you're comparing to animal agriculture, it's a significant more amount of yield still. And then there's been some studies. There's a group out of Europe called the Biocyclic Vegan Movement. They have a researcher and soil scientist there, Johann Eisenbach, and he is looking at kind of the different yield of different crops of growing in this method, and showed that certain crops can actually produce even more yield than typical plant agriculture. And, to kind of understand how this is done without manure and synthetic fertilizers, you can absolutely get all the nutrients you need to grow great soil from a combination of compost, but also native crops, and some would call that like cover crops. So when you're growing these things, you can feed the compost and start creating some high quality soil. Now, in terms of scaling that across the world, that would come with some challenges. But if you think of municipal compost systems, they're very commonplace. Oftentimes, though, unfortunately, they also involve animal source foods that are thrown out as part of these kind of municipal compost systems. But, over time, they've banned, putting bones in there and things like that, because obviously that's not helping the compost system. You could easily also put in rules to exclude all animal source foods from these compost systems, and then integrate local native vegetation from the area. And then you're getting a whole lot of veganic soil being created for the local farms. And that is, to me, that is regenerative agriculture, because you're growing plants that you don't need to let the land rest after a number of years. It's actually increasing soil organic carbon. You're getting a good yield. You can have a diversity of hundreds of different plants on a farm. The best part too is you can free up all kinds of land at the same time. So yeah, this is an underappreciated way of farming. This is the real regenerative agriculture. What we need is kind of an increased awareness of it from a policy side and a consumer side. And yeah, back to your point, Hope, I would love to be able to know if something in a grocery store is grown veganically, because I would 100% choose that.
Yeah, and when you listed all of those things that go into conventional and organic agriculture, the blood meal and bone meal and fish meal, oh, it's all so gross, and I don't like to think about that. I don't want to think about that when I'm buying my vegetables. And I wish so much that there was a vegan alternative. And hey, it's better for the environment too. It's so much better ecologically. Yeah, we need more veganic farmers out there.
Big time. Yep. And they're around. There is a bit of a small movement. I would say there's likely more veganic farms than there are actual regenerative ranches, because that whole term is used so loosely, and there's so little regulation and awareness, where you can tell if it's a veganic farm. Like you know what's going into it. You can see the processes of it. With regenerative ranching, it's all storytelling. It's all things that are used as buzzwords. And the aspects of regenerative ranching or regenerative agriculture that are positive are also in veganic farming, like the cover crops, not tilling, having different compost options as well. That all is part of veganic farming too.
Great. Well, I hope everyone looks for their local veganic farm. If you have one in your area, support them. Well, I have really enjoyed this conversation. I love this stuff. I could talk about this stuff all day, but I think I must ask our last question, which is, what gives you hope for the future?
I get a lot of hope from the increased awareness that we're now seeing around food system as a whole. We're seeing in these environmental conferences, which are not necessarily the most optimistic areas of hope. A lot of it is just kind of the rich and politicians meeting up together. But we're now seeing activists mobilizing and saying that we need a plant-based food system. There's now just an abundance of increased knowledge on the topic. And with that, we're also seeing systemic change. And you can look at all kinds of different areas of society, and you're seeing an improved welcome message to the need to shift to plant-based diets. We're talking from childcare centers to schools to universities to municipalities, cities, to countries, to businesses. I just saw, of course, LinkedIn recently as a company is looking at increasing plant-based options in their cafeterias. You just wouldn't see that 5-6 years ago. So I think there's this increased kind of movement to have this as part of the wider environmental space. You're seeing longtime journalists like George Monbiot dedicating his almost entire career to this exact topic. This is someone who, of course, like a lot of us, ate meat before and had different beliefs on this topic too. But then you just can only ignore the science for so long and still be seen as credible, right? And of course, he came to the topic and understood, and his entire new book called Regenesis is specifically saying that we need to shift to plant-based diets, and in his case he's advocating for some of the more technological sides like precision fermentation. And with that you can see all kinds of opportunities to free up land and replicate the taste and texture that people have liked before with meat, but get it with eco-friendly plant-based options. There is all kinds of things to be hopeful about in this space. And there's many people that are offering solutions and working at those. So yeah, I welcome that. And I hope to see a lot more of it.
Well, Nicolas, thank you so much for writing your chapter. It's called Grazing versus the Planet in our book, The Humane Hoax. And I really appreciate all the work you're doing, all your knowledge that you're sharing. And thank you so much for being on the podcast.
Thanks so much for having me on. Really enjoyed the chat.
Thank you for listening to the Hope for the Animals podcast, sponsored by Compassionate Living. So, next week, we will keep the book theme going, and we will have our second session of the Humane Hoax Book Club with the other half of our Humane Hoax team, two volunteers with the Humane Hoax Project, Marian Erickson and Fireweed. And we will talk about a few more of the chapters in the book. Please help us get the word out about this book. Share about the book, share this episode. And most important right now, this is my big ask to you for my dedicated listeners. If you can please write a review on Amazon. You don't have to buy the book on Amazon to write a review. I believe you do have to be a customer, perhaps, but if you can, please give the book a 5-star rating and write a review on Amazon. That will help so much to get more attention to this book, get it out to a wider audience. There's not many reviews right now, so please help me to get more reviews on Amazon. I hope that Earth Day was inspiring for you. I hope that you can find ways to go even further, do even more for the planet, and sharing about this book, helping us to get this book out to as many people as possible is one way that you can help. So thank you so much for the animals, for the planet. Live vegan.